I'm Mark Golub, and in the news, the political scene in Israel. As Israeli elections approach on April 9th, while Israel's sitting Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, lives under a cloud of criminal indictment, Israel's Attorney General, Avichai Mandelblit, has said he will indict Mr. Netanyahu on charges of bribery, fraud, and breach of trust. And of course, this throws the Israeli elections into turmoil, if not chaos. Of late, Israel's new blue and white party, led by former General Chief of Staff Benny Gantz and Yair Lapid, the creator of the failed Yesh Atid party. Blue and white is leading in the polls, and by a surprisingly healthy margin. Now, the charges against the Prime Minister are one, that Mr. Netanyahu accepted gifts such as expensive champagne and cigars from an Israeli billionaire in return for favors. Two, that when he was communications director, Benjamin Netanyahu made a deal with Israel's giant telecom company Bezeq so that Bezek's news operation Walla would give Netanyahu favorable press coverage in return for certain government rulings favorable to the owners of Bezeq. And three, that Benjamin Netanyahu made a deal with the owner of the Israeli newspaper Yediot Ahronot to help the newspaper in its battle with Sheldon Adelson's Israel Hayom, again in return for positive press coverage. Mr. Netanyahu, on the other hand, has answers for all three charges, though he seems to be losing traction among the Israeli electorate. Well, one longtime friend of Bibi Netanyahu, who's one of the world's leading civil rights and constitutional lawyers, Alan Dershowitz, has come out publicly in defense of Mr. Netanyahu, and some reports indicate he will be personally engaged in the Prime Minister's defense, for which Alan Dershowitz has come under some rather strident attack in the Jewish community. And as always, I am so pleased to have Alan Dershowitz with us to discuss all of these issues. Alan is Professor Emeritus at Harvard Law School. He's the author of, among scores of other books, his latest book, The Case Against the Democratic House, Impeaching Trump. And Alan, thank you so much for joining us again.
Thank you so much. We live in a strange world where when you defend the Prime Minister of Israel, you're attacked. If I were defending the head of Hamas, the same kind of radical left people would probably be praising me. You know, we live in an age of new McCarthyism, particularly from the hard left, where the hard left doesn't want you to defend people who they don't like. It really reminds me of the 50s when I was in college, when you got in trouble if you were a lawyer and you defended communists. Today it comes from the left. Back then it came from the right. It's the same form of McCarthyism.
By the way, it was so outrageous then. It is no less outrageous now, and we'll talk about it in 1 minute. So before I ask you to comment on the attacks against you, and there was a very strong piece written, published by Eric Yoffie in Haaretz, and the first question is it true, Alan, that you'll be joining Mr. Netanyahu's defense team?
No, there's no indication of that. He has very good lawyers in Israel. I have been not defending Netanyahu. I've been defending Israeli law. I think it's very dangerous for any legal system to consider good coverage or the absence of bad coverage to be part of bribery elements of a crime. If that were the case, I mean, every politician wants good coverage. Every politician wants to end bad coverage, and often their votes are at least in part influenced by the desire to get good coverage. Take, for example, the case 2000 against Netanyahu, which involved the newspaper Yediot Ahronot, which had been devastatingly critical of Netanyahu and his wife and his son. And in the end, Netanyahu voted against the law, which would have which the Yediot Ahronot wanted, which would have prevented Israel Hayom from publishing without charging. But he had a discussion, which his side taped. I think it was an attempt to show that the editor of, or the owner of Yedioth Ahronot is viable, that he would be willing to change his coverage based on more positive legislation. But in the end, nothing happened. In the end, 40-something members of the Knesset did vote for the law, and they got good coverage, and none of them has been investigated. As I said on an Israeli program recently, if you ask the Knesset to pass a law that made it a crime to exchange votes or legislation for good coverage, not a single member of the Knesset would vote for that, because every one of them would be investigated. Yeah. And if you couldn't get the members of the Knesset to vote for a criminal law, prosecutors shouldn't be prosecuting people for that law. They shouldn't be expanding it to a point where the legislature wouldn't approve and wouldn't have voted for it. So I wrote critically of that. I did an open letter to my friend, who I admire enormously, Avichai Mandelblit, who I've known since he is a young lawyer, and I have enormous respect for him, warning of the implications, not for Netanyahu, but for the Israeli legal system, for freedom of the press, for the ability of politicians and the media to operate in a nuanced way. And for that, I got savaged by Jews, some Americans, some Israelis, from the extreme hard left.
By the way, I'm going to jump to that at the moment. There are questions I want to ask you about Netanyahu, but you've brought up this piece that was written by Rabbi Eric Yoffie, who's the former head of the Union for Reform Judaism. And by the way, Eric appears regularly on JBS. But he wrote a scathing critique of you in Haaretz, in which he said the following: if there is anything more pitiful than Benjamin Netanyahu's desperate attempt to hang on to his office and avoid criminal charges, it is Alan Dershowitz's desperate attempt to provide cover for the cynical, paranoid, ego-driven Prime Minister. The day before, Attorney General Mandelblit was expected to announce his intention to file corruption charges against the Prime Minister. Bibi cited an article published in Haaretz in December in which Dershowitz told Mandelblit that if he would proceed with the charges, he would, quote, endanger democracy and freedom of the press in Israel, unquote. Eric then goes on to suggest you have been pushed into defending Mr. Netanyahu by Sheldon Adelson, the American Jewish billionaire who's been a huge supporter of the Prime Minister. And Eric wonders in his piece how much money Sheldon Adelson funneled to you so that you would write in favor of Mr. Netanyahu.
When I first read the piece...
In general, I want you to respond to that, and then we'll talk some of the issues involved in it.
When I first read the piece about me doing this for the money, I thought it was written by Ilan Omer, the Muslim member of Congress, who talks about Jews voting for Israel, or congressmen voting for Israel because of the Benjamins. Yoffie's attack on me was an anti-Semitic screed. Jews do it for the money. We don't do it for principle. We don't do it because we believe in the legal system. Somehow Sheldon Adelson is making me do this because he has so much money. Just today, a congressman in the United States was criticized because he said maybe that Steyer, the guy who's calling for the impeachment, was influencing Nadler for money. Oh, that was anti-Semitic. But when Yoffie says it, it's not anti-Semitic. The idea that I'm under the influence of a rich man because I've represented his corporation on occasion. I've never discussed the matter with Adelson. I wouldn't listen to anybody. I operate completely out of principle. I believe this very strongly. And the idea that Yoffie would suggest that I'm doing it for the money sounds like something Hezbollah or Hamas or the maybe Palestinian Authority would say. Maybe I support Israel for the money. It's such an absurd and such an anti-Semitic attack that he should be ashamed of himself for even suggesting that I would do it for the money. But he did something even worse. He pretended that he liked me before, that I was somehow his hero, and I've now disappointed him. 24 years ago, he engaged in a similar McCarthyite tactic, publicly attacking me for representing O.J. Simpson, saying that it was un-Jewish to represent somebody who was guilty. I had to remind this rabbi of Abraham, defending the sinners of Saddam. I had to remind this American of John Adams defending the people accused of the Boston Massacre. I attacked him mercilessly when he did that. I then made a speech at Hebrew Union College talking about Jewish law and defending the guilty. He refused to attend. When another prominent rabbi asked him to meet with me to discuss it, he refused to do that. He hides that bigotry and bias against me and says I was his hero. We've been in a war for a quarter of a century, an ideological war, fighting with each other. I have been appalled at the way Eric Yoffie has turned against Israel, how he's applied a double standard to everything Israel does, regardless of who the prime minister is, whether it's a liberal or conservative, whether it's Olmert or Ehud Barak. You can count on Yoffie always to apply a double standard to Israel. So this attack in Haaretz is not an attack on my ideas, it's an attack on me. He uses the following words in the heading: pitiful, conspiratorial, ludicrous. Never responds to my arguments on the merits. When he tries to, all he does is make a fool of himself because he's an ignoramus when it comes to the law. And unfortunately, he's an ignoramus when it comes to Jewish law and when it comes to Jewish values. And it's a tragedy that you have a rabbi who was head of the Reform movement who's prepared to engage in such ad hominems and to attack somebody for defending the Prime Minister of Israel. And I'm not even defending the Prime Minister, I'm defending the principle of law. And I can assure you, Rabbi Yoffie, I'm going to continue to do that. I'm not going to be cowed by your bigotry, and I'm not going to be frightened away by your personal attacks. If he wants to debate me on the merits of my ideas, I'd be happy to do that. But he's not going to do that. He just wants to attack me by calling me names. And if he wants to do that, I think people will understand his motives, particularly now that I've exposed him as somebody who's had a vendetta against me for a quarter of a century, which he hid, which he failed to disclose in this article.
Alan, I'm in the following position. Again, as I said a moment ago, Eric is on JBS a lot. You know, I'm very well acquainted with the spectrum of Jewish opinion that you and I have to deal with now virtually every day, and especially those in the more liberal communities of Jewish.
I don't agree with liberal. I'm very liberal. We're talking about radical.
By the way, hold on.
We're talking about unthinking radicals.
I'm not talking politically liberal. What I'm talking about within the Jewish community, there are the liberal movements, Reform movement, conservative movement, and I've been very concerned with the extent to which within the Reform movement there seems to be rabbis who are more and more willing, even driven, to be critical of Israel with what I consider to be no context and no bias. And the issue is, to what extent are they really helping or hurting Israel? In that context, Eric Yoffie has been a positive voice within the Reform movement for the state of Israel. I have a real problem with the piece he wrote about you here, and by the way, I'm happy to ask him if he would ever come on JBS with you so that you could have a discussion, not a match, not a fight, but a discussion. But what he does in his piece is he takes every one of your arguments and he says, you know, when you first look at it, Alan Dershowitz seems to make sense. And then he tries to show why, from his perspective, there are mitigating circumstances which make what Netanyahu did, from Eric's perspective, unacceptable. What would you say to Eric in that context?
Let me give you an example of an argument. He says, I make a good point about the media. I make a good point about it might be dangerous to the media to start prosecuting people who are seeking good coverage. Then instead of responding to that, he says, but Alan Dershowitz's client, Sheldon Adelson, has done more to destroy freedom of the press in Israel than anyone else. So he doesn't respond to the argument. He just goes from ad hominem to ad hominem. first attacking me personally, then attacking Sheldon Adelson. What has Sheldon Adelson done to destroy free press in Israel? He's created a competitive newspaper, Yisrael Hayom, which is distributed free. It makes money through advertising. That's a perfectly acceptable business model. How does that diminish free press in Israel? It increases the marketplace of ideas. So again, just ad hominem after ad hominem without any thoughtful arguments. If he wants to debate me, I'm happy to debate him. A prominent rabbi, a very prominent Reform rabbi, tried to arrange that at the Hebrew Union College, either a private discussion or a public debate, and Yoffie refused to do it. You talk about him as a liberal. Is it liberal to say that a lawyer shouldn't defend somebody who's accused of a serious crime? I don't think that's liberal. I think that's reactionary. I think that's repressive. I think that's typical of the hard Stalinist left, that we know the truth. We don't need to have people making arguments on the other side. Let's assume he's right about Netanyahu and I'm wrong. What is wrong with having two sides presented?
Of
What
course.
is wrong with an open letter
Of
to the
course.
Attorney General, who's a friend of mine, urging him to at least seriously consider the implications of indicting based on the desire for good press? But the result is this kind of screed, this ad hominem attack on me. I think it's beneath contempt. And the idea that I did it for money, I mean, again, it's exactly what we argue against, what we call anti-Semitic, when a congresswoman from Minnesota or Michigan makes similar arguments.
You know, he does say at the end of his piece, you were once a great defender of Israel. Now you've become a great defender of Netanyahu, which are two very different things.
Of course, that's right.
A lot of this is driven, Alan, by the extent to which there are American Jews who just hate Netanyahu the same way they hate Trump. And
they hate Netanyahu because he embarrasses them. When they go to dinner parties, they have a hard time defending him. My articles are not about Netanyahu. They're not about him. I won't even tell you on this television show who I would vote for if I were an Israeli. I'm a liberal, supporter of the two-state solution. I've been opposed to some of Israel's settlement policies. This is not about helping Netanyahu politically. It's about helping the rule of law. But like so many other people, his hatred for Netanyahu blinds him to the implications. It is a little bit like what's going on with Trump. I'm I voted against Trump. I voted for Hillary Clinton. I'm a liberal Democrat. But I don't want to see the law distorted. It was H.L. Mencken who said, first they come after the SOBs and they establish terrible precedents on their back, and then they use those precedents against the rest of us. So I'm going to continue to defend the principles of law, whether they apply to Netanyahu, whether they apply to anyone else, whether they apply to Hillary Clinton, or whether they apply to Donald Trump. I will never make partisan decisions about the law. I'm not doing this to help Netanyahu. I'm doing this because I love the Israeli legal system. I've written extensively about it. And Eric Yoffie doesn't know a thing about the Israeli legal system. He doesn't understand it. He doesn't know anything about it. He doesn't know anything about the law. I mean, he does fit the title of one of my books. He has an enormous amount of chutzpah and arrogance. But when it comes to substance, he is a zero.
And I do want to ask you, aren't you, however, close to Netanyahu personally as well? And that gives the appearance to it, to some people in the Jewish community, that you have, there's something beyond principle driving you.
I am very close to Olmert. I was very close to Rabin. I am close to, just spoke to him the other day on the phone, Ehud Barak. I have been close to every Israeli prime minister that has been in office since I have become of age. I have been close to several American presidents. I don't make decisions on that basis. I make decisions on the basis of the law. I did actually help write a brief for Olmert when he was being prosecuted. I actually played a role in that case. So I had a closer relationship there, but I don't hear myself being attacked on that basis. And Olmert and Netanyahu, of course, don't get along with each other. I'm also close to Rivlin, the president of Israel, who doesn't get along very well with Netanyahu. So I try to remain close to all Israeli political figures. I don't take public positions about who people should vote for in elections. I do take the position that a person who's been duly elected, and when the Knesset would not pass the kinds of laws that would cause his actions to be violative of criminal statutes, that prosecutors shouldn't be prosecuting anyone on the basis of vague, open-ended statutes like abuse of trust, which is what he was indicted for on the 2000 case. So I stick with my principles. That's the way I do it. And for shame on anybody who thinks I do it for the money. I don't do it for the money. I never have. I never will. I do more pro bono cases than any lawyer in America today who is not working for a pro bono organization. I represent half of my clients pro bono. I work virtually full-time for Aleph, trying to free Jewish prisoners in prison who are today either unjustly imprisoned or have too long sentences. I do so much work. I spent a decade of my life working pro bono on behalf of Soviet Jewry. I want to ask Eric Yoffie whether he's ever done anything without being compensated for it. What is his pro bono profile compared to mine? The idea that I would be attacked for doing something for money when I devote half my life since I was 20 years old to pro bono work is just so absurd and so counterfactual that he ought to be ashamed of himself.
Well, Alan, you've heard me say numerous times on JBS, in your presence, and I've said it when you're not present, I think you are one of the most courageous Jews of our generation. I think what you've done with your life, both in terms of the American context and fighting for certain principles and certain liberal values and certain constitutional values and civil rights, has been enthralling. And I also believe there is no one, and I've said this many times, there is no one who defends Israel better than you do in the world today. And I have been, you've heard me say this again, I have been so hurt for you by the way you've been treated. And Alan, just so you know, there are people who write me all the time scathing emails because I am not bashing Alan Dershowitz. Well,
go ahead and bash. It's okay. I have a thick skin. I'm used to being bashed. Yeah.
I don't bash you because I believe what you're doing is right. And I wish the Jewish community as a whole had been able to maintain their principles and their values despite who is president and despite who is prime minister. And I'm going to applaud you, and I'm going to encourage you, and I'm going to make sure you have a platform here on JBS, and you don't need it. You're all over. Everybody wants you, Al. You know, for all the people who are critical of you, everybody wants you. And I want you too, and I am proud of you, and I'm proud that I've been able to give you the kind of platform as small as JBS is. At least when you come on here, nobody is giving you 3 minutes. You get a half hour. But I want you to understand how very proud I am of you, impressed I am of you, and I don't give a darn what people say about me because I support you. And having said that, I want to ask you a different kind of question. You told me you're friends with Mandelblit. Why doesn't he see this the way you see it? What's driving him?
He's a very fair man. I think he is very, very troubled about this case. I think it took him a long time to come to this conclusion. I think he's looking at the small picture rather than the big picture, and maybe that's his job. He's looking at the fact that he thinks Netanyahu took too many bottles of champagne and too many cigars. My answer to that is pass a statute saying if it's more than 1,000 shekels, you can't do it. If it's more than 10,000 shekels, pass a law so we know how much is too much. But don't prosecute based on just an assumption that a certain amount is too much, even though the statute doesn't say it. Do the same with good coverage or bad coverage. I think he's very well-intentioned, but I think he looks at this case without looking at the big picture of what the implications are for Israel. Look, we can have reasonable debates about this. I'm happy to debate anybody. I did this morning on an Israeli show. We had a very good debate with somebody who is a former state prosecutor. We had a reasonable debate, but he didn't look me in the eye and say, you're doing this because you're a Jew, and Jews do things because they take money from people, and they're money-grubbing, money-hungry people, which is what Yoffie essentially did. I want everybody again to think, if what Yoffie said about me was said by Ilyan, Omar, or any of the other people who constantly make anti-Semitic comments, we would label it anti-Semitic. We should label it anti-Semitic when it's done by a self-hating Jew as well, when it's done by a man who can't understand that another Jew could disagree with him and do something on principle, and immediately looks for dollar signs and looks for ways of attacking based on anti-Semitic tropes. So I think the news headline today is that Eric Yoffie has disqualified himself from being taken seriously in the Jewish community by leveling an anti-Semitic attack on me, claiming that I've done it for the money and that I'm not principled, and like other Jews, I'm just following the money. That's the headline for today. Okay. And I think you ought to have Eric Yoffie on and ask him to explain why he went first to the money. That was his first argument. The money, the money. It's Sheldon Adelson. He has influence over him. How is that different from Omar saying that Israel hypnotizes the rest of the world, or that the supporters in Congress do it because of the Benjamins? Basically, what he's saying is, I do it because of the Benjamins. And it doesn't matter whether it comes from him or it comes from Omar. It's anti-Semitic to its core.
Is all the nice things I said about you, I want to say this. I do not believe Eric Yoffie is a self-hating Jew, although I disagree with him strongly on many, many issues. By the way, if Eric were willing to come on JBS with you, would you be comfortable in that setting or not?
Of course, of course, of course. The first question I would ask him was why he went right for the money, why he couldn't just argue on the merits. Why does he have to assume that I'm influenced by Sheldon Adelson, who I haven't spoken to in months and months and months? And when I speak to him, it's about, his business and about my representation of the Sands. But the idea that he would tell me what to write, or that I would seek his approval, or that I'm being pushed into doing this, it's so absurd. I've known Netanyahu well before Sheldon Adelson ever met Netanyahu. I met Netanyahu when he was living in Cambridge, when his name was Ben Natai. Yes. And we've had an acquaintanceship over almost a half a century. That doesn't mean that I support him politically. I was very appalled at Netanyahu's work, whatever it was he did, and there may be disputes about the facts of bringing that racist Kahana party into the mainstream. I think that was wrong, and I will publicly, and I have in the past, publicly condemned him for it. I think it's a mistake, and I don't think a prime minister of Israel should be in any way facilitating the legitimation and the mainstreaming of a Kahanist party.
Alan, it is always so wonderful that you find time for us and JBS. I am so grateful. I'm going to see if Eric wants to come on with you. And in the meantime, I'm going to chase you all the time. Kol tuv v'hatzlacha. Continue the work you're doing, it just as you're doing it. Just make sure you have time every now for JBS.
I will do that because I love being on with you.
Thank you, my friend. Be well.
Be well. Bye.
There you have it. Alan Dershowitz, Professor Emeritus at Harvard Law School, the author of The Case Against the Democratic House Impeaching Trump. He's a controversial figure. He says it from his heart. And I know you understand what I feel for him. As always, my thanks to our director, Sloan Copeland, JBS's Associate Director, Dara Golub, Editor, John McDevitt, and to the producer of In the News, Carol Lilienthal. Until the next time, I'm Mark Golub. Be well, my friends.